I think that the U.S. government and, of course, President Trump sent a very strong message to them, with capturing Maduro. We couldn't allow to have Chinese and Russian, entities to take full control of, the largest reserve of oil in the world. Imagine that, for the economy of the United States, it's extremely risky. And in addition to that, we have terrorist groups in Venezuela, because you're dealing with Iran. Hezbollah has been in Venezuela operating, for over 20 years. They have a stronghold in Venezuela, and this is here in our hemisphere. There's still some heads of the state in Venezuela that they're not gonna change the attitude. They have this socialist, communist ideology that they're not gonna change. Just because Maduro was taken down. One of them is Diosdado Cabello. This guy, he was the brains after a lot of the stuff that Maduro was doing, specifically related to money laundering and.
Hi, my guest today is Andres Mahecha. He's a U.S. Army veteran, retired NYPD detective first grade, former U.S. Department of Homeland Security Task Force officer with ICE, whose decorated career spanned undercover narcotics operations, cartel investigations, and high-risk maritime interdictions. Welcome to the show, sir, and good to see you.
Thank you very much for the invite. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about your story. Where do you come from? How you joined the army and then law enforcement, and what's your story in general?
Sure. Basically, I was born and raised in Colombia. I arrived to the United States when I was 14 years old. This is back in 1988. So I went from Colombia, the capital, from Bogota, and I went from Bogota to New York City. Specifically, I went to Brooklyn, to a neighborhood in Brooklyn that at the time was extremely difficult. It was rough. It was 1988. And I don't know if you're aware, this is before your time probably. This is 1988. And at the time, the United States had a huge problem with crack cocaine. They called it at that time crack era. And New York City at the time was probably like the main hub for what was going on with the crack cocaine, along with other major cities, but New York City was pretty bad. So I landed specifically in a neighborhood that was completely being destroyed by crack cocaine. And I went and lived across the street from the projects. I don't know if you're familiar with the projects in New York City, those big tall buildings, and they hold thousands of people there. And the projects were being kidnapped by the consumption of, of drugs and stuff like that. And you walk around the street and you'll see like the small, like plastic vials of crack cocaine all over the place with different colors, because every drug dealer had a separate color for the vials. So they'll have control of one corner, another person will have control of other corner. And then as you're walking around, you see the different empty vials of crack cocaine with different colors. So that's basically where I grew up. Once I was 14, I was basically witnessing what was going on during the crack era. And then after that, well, obviously I went to high school. So, I was in high school, and I talk about all these experiences on my book, Narco Ranger. I talk about all this stuff that was going on in at that moment in Brooklyn, in Bushwick, New York specific, and how that made an impact in my life, And there were like police, undercover narcotics teams that they were very actively engaging all this activity that was going on the street. And I witnessed all this stuff, and that like kind of stuck in my mind, and I loved that stuff. I was like, man, I want to be that guy one day, So it was part of, I guess, like visualizing, knowing that this was something you wanted to do. And even when I was a kid in Colombia, I used to cut pictures of police raids and search warrants and stuff, like big stuff that was going on in Colombia, because in 1988 there was a war between the Cali and the Medellin cartel. And so in Colombia, it was visible that there was a lot of police activity, and there was even some bombings that were going on and on and on. I used to pick up magazines, from adults that would leave magazines laying around, and I would cut these articles of police stuff and military, and at night I used to look at them, I was infatuated with all this military and police stuff. So it was always in my head. And then I experienced the same thing when I was in Brooklyn. It was something I always wanted to do. So I went to high school graduated high school in Bushwick, and I started college, a community college, but college wasn't something that I really was interested in doing, and I never had the mental focus to stay in class and pay attention. Even though I would sit on the first row of class and the professor was there teaching, I was like, 80% of the stuff was gone, and I wasn't getting anything. So I said, listen, I have to make a decision about what's going to happen to my life. The decision now or what's going to be of my life in the future. So that's when I joined the army. So I left college, I left the community college, and I joined the military. I went to the United States Army. I volunteered as an infantryman. I spent 3 years. That was between 95 to 1998. And immediately after I left the U.S. Army, I became a police officer. And that's when basically my career kicked off.
So you were a police officer in New York during the 9/11 and the aftermath of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. How about 19 I had about maybe 3 or 4 years on the job, and I was working in transit. So transit is basically the uniformed police officers that ride the trains in New York City back and forth. So I got assigned to Transit District 20. Transit District 20 is in Queens, New York City, and I used to live in Queens. I used to live only like a couple of blocks away actually from the district. And that was my first assignment as a police officer. That's where my career started, in transit. Yeah. And it happened, and I was in transit during 2001 and all the stuff that happened during 9/11. So yeah, we responded. We went to World Trade Center, not as much as the rest of the cops because we had also an important assignment on keeping everyone safe in the subway systems. And there were rumors of attacks that were going to happen in the subways. And also we had to stay by those connections, the tunnels that connect between Brooklyn and Manhattan and Queens. Those were like, very sensitive post. So for the most part, we spent a lot of time guarding those tunnels, because anything happening to any of those tunnels would have disrupted, of course, the entire city. So it was a huge thing for us to maintain security on those posts. So for the most part, I think the transit mission during 9/11 was just to keep the entire system safe. So that's basically where I was around that time.
So after that, or maybe even prior to that, what are some of the biggest cases or stories from your service in NYPD and also in Homeland Security that you want to share? Something that, what one of the, or some of the biggest investigations in your career?
Well, that's just so many of them, not to brag or anything, but I was blessed, I guess, in that way where for some reason or another, I just landed at the right time, at the right place, and I was able to succeed in some of these missions. And I don't know, it's just like I landed at the right units and with the right cases all the time. It was just something that was happening. And I mean, there were numerous cases. After transit, I was doing the pickpocket unit on the trains, and really we were helping detectives on the road to catch some of these pickpocket teams that they weren't only working on the trains, but they were also working on the streets and doing hits on the streets. So the detectives from different units were getting different complaints from grand larcenies from the person. This means that someone was taking property from their persons and using their credit cards for fraud and a whole bunch of stuff. So they will come to our unit for help, and we will helping them. And the question in my head became like, okay, I'm a police officer, I'm not a detective, but I'm helping other detectives. So I want to be a detective. So that was something that was in my head also. The progression basically was also because one specific person in the at the police academy always he told me, he used to tell us all the time, during your career in the police department, you need to be promoted at least once. This was something that he always said to us, don't just become a police officer and do 20 years as a beat police officer on the beat. And, you know, what does that? And that stuck to my head. And so this was the moment for me when I was doing pickpockets. And I was like, wait a minute, I want to be a detective. I want to be like those guys. I want to do investigations. I want to move further in my career. And so I approached my sergeant at the time and I was like, listen, I want to be a detective one day like those guys. How do I go about that? And then that's when he said to me, the only way that you're gonna become a detective now because you're young in your career is to volunteer for narcotics. So that's when I volunteered for narcotics. And I volunteered as an undercover and I started doing undercover work. And that's basically when my career took off. And there's a couple of cases that are extremely important and big cases. One of them was the Robert Chambers case. Robert Chambers was an individual who killed a young girl in Central Park in New York City back in the early 80s. Okay. He came from a rich family, lived in the city. He made a claim that this happened during rough sex, and that basically was his defense. To make a long story short, he fought the case. It looks like it was going to be a mistrial where they were going to have to show the evidence to a different jury for a second time. And the mother of the victim didn't want to go through this again. So I think the prosecution worked out a deal and they offered him a manslaughter charge. He took it and he served 15 years in jail only for the murder of Jennifer Levine. So after he came out of jail, the media is all over and they're filming him and he's doing interviews and all this other stuff after he got out of jail. But it turns out that he was selling cocaine from his apartment. And this word came to us. And at the time I was assigned to Manhattan South Major Case Unit as an undercover. Basically, the prosecutor's office came to us and said, listen, Robert Chambers is back again at it. And he was already on parole for life because of the murder. So we just happened to have someone that was still in contact with him. And that person made an introduction. And I went upstairs. I started talking to him. We started doing deals progressively. We started buying more and more and more cocaine. And at the time, there wasn't too many undercovers taking small cameras with them, because of the risk. But I knew how important this mission was, so I decided to take a video camera with me every time. And I recorded all those buys, which was great because there's nothing, a picture shows everything, right? So being able to record him and how he brag about the quality of the product and him counting the money and all that stuff, it was great footage. And we got him good, and at the end of the case, he ended up actually serving more time for my buys than for the killing of Jennifer Levine. So I think that was one of the very good cases that I had in my career as an undercover. Later on, when I became a task force officer, I self-initiated a big operation against basically what you see on TV, those boats that right now the Navy is bombing and is going against all the stuff that's going on in Venezuela. That's basically what I was doing, except that at the time we weren't blowing up everything. We were just doing the interdiction along with the Coast Guard. My main objective and an area of operations was the Pacific coast of Colombia, where all these boats were leaving, every single day. I mean, they still do. They're still at their routes, leaving every single day. I think that based on the study that we were doing, because we were mapping up all the routes and we had tons of intelligence. And at the time, I think we were seizing only 20% of the total boats that they were departing from Colombia. So you can imagine. And in my case alone, we seize over 20,000 kilos of cocaine. So, and this is just something small. This is insignificant in comparison to how many kilos we're living. And then another case that also was really good, and all this stuff I talk about in my book, is after I left the NYPD, I became an agent for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and I was able to also land in another task force. And I became in contact back with Homeland Security, and I started working with the guys from Homeland Security here in Miami. And instead of going for the maritime guys, I went after the guys who were sending the planes out of Venezuela. This is something that is not really talked about in the news, and nobody talks about. But the planes is a huge problem down there. It's huge. They leave from Venezuela, from Maracaibo, that whole corridor that's basically in the border with Colombia. The Colombians move the product up. The ELN, the FARC, all the guerrillas, they offer the protection, they offer the logistics. They're in charge of all the airstrips, the airfields, everything, the production, the transportation, the stash houses, the protection. That's all being run by obviously Venezuelan military because they get a portion of every single load that goes out. And then you got the FARC, you got the ELN, you got other groups that are assisting. They always crossing the border between Colombia and Venezuela, border for them to go across and do what they're doing. So I was doing those cases at the planes that would leave Venezuela going to Central America. And this was going on every single day. Every single day there was a plane. And I'm not talking about just little planes. We will see the Cessnas almost every single day, the Cessna 210 and smaller planes that could hold loads of probably anywhere between 450 to 600 kilos. But also every once in a while, maybe once a month or maybe once every 3 weeks, we'll get those Gulfstreams 4 and 5. Those big huge planes, like passenger planes, that could hold like 2,500, 2,300 kilos, leave out of Venezuela to different destinations, Central America, or sometimes to the other coast to go into Africa, because from Africa you got that corridor that goes into Europe. So planes were living in that direction. So now that this is a hot topic, this is what a lot of people don't understand, like why Maduro was taken down, and why, the military they have a nickname for them as Cartel de los Soles, and it's because they deeply involved in all these operations. They know what's going on. As a matter of fact, when these planes, they have to pay a certain amount of money depending on how many kilos they have to pay the military. And when they don't pay, or when they don't make these contacts, and when the military doesn't agree to cover these loads, they take them down. Because I used to get those phone calls. They're like, "Oh, listen, they're gonna take down that plane because they didn't call the general, or nothing. Nobody they didn't notify anyone about this load." So, and then you will see it. We'll get the images later on about the plane being shot down by the military. Cause and then the good part, the crazy part, man, that always drove me crazy, was anytime the Venezuelan government did one of these interdictions or blowing up a plane, it'll come out on the Venezuelan news as like, "Oh, we conducting anti-narcotics operations." These anti-narcotics operations was nothing more than like, "Hey, you not paying, guess what's gonna happen to you? We're gonna blow up your plane." So these were some of the cases that I talk about in my book, Narco Ranger, and it's like, just with the highest points in my career.
Yeah. And I'll definitely leave the link to your book in the video description so that if you're listening to this, feel free to go to Amazon and buy the book and check it out. So, with this unique perspective on the region, Venezuela, Colombia, what do you think will happen next there? Because now that Maduro is out, there is this temporary government, which is basically the same people that work under Maduro, but now under some kind of supervision by the United States. Colombia is probably still the same. I suspect that all of the drug cartels that were operating there are still operating. So what do you think will change in the region now that Maduro is out and in the US standing in trial?
I think that the U.S. government, and of course President Trump, sent a very strong message to them, with capturing Maduro, and they basically told everyone in the region, "Listen, calm down," and also it's not just the narcotics, but you got to understand, like we couldn't allow to have Chinese and Russian, entities to take full control of, the largest reserve of oil in the world. Imagine that, for the economy of the United States is extremely risky. And in addition to that, we have terrorist groups in Venezuela, because you're dealing with Iran. Hezbollah has been in Venezuela operating for, so many years, for over 20 years. They have a stronghold in Venezuela, and this is here in our hemisphere. So extremely difficult situation there in Venezuela. I think the regime knows that, anything can happen to them unless they start listening to President Trump and what he wants. I think that the main objective of the U.S. government, obviously, is to restore democracy. We know that those they stole the elections. I think that in the future we'll probably see another election and a change completely of democracy in Venezuela, right? Because this regime, and also there's still some heads of the state in Venezuela that they're not gonna change the attitude. You know, they have this socialist, communist ideology that they're not gonna change. You know, just because Maduro was taken down. You know, one of them is Diosdado Cabello. This guy, he was actually he was the brains after a lot of the stuff that Maduro was doing, specifically related to money laundering and narcotics operations that the regime was conducting. So that's one guy that eventually he's gonna have to go. You know, so this has to be a lot of changes. The United States of America is going to have a strong presence there, reopen the United States Embassy. Obviously, diplomacy is going to take, is going to take priority, and it's going to be the main thing that the United States has to do initially in order to have some control until eventually the people of Venezuela decide who's going to be in charge and how they're going to run the country. As far as Colombia, Trump also was putting extremely a lot of pressure into Petro, who's also in alliance with the ELN, who's also a narco-terrorist organization, and FARC members and a whole bunch of other people. You know, he's making it seem like he's fighting, narco-terrorism, but he's friends with some of them, and he dislikes other who they don't agree with his policies, so he's going after them. And I got a feeling that what he's doing now, because there's going to be a meeting between President Petro and Trump, and I think what he's trying to do is he's a very slick guy. I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to use the United States and and President Trump's policies, and he's willing to fight narcotics to go against his enemies, which is mainly the ELN, because he's seen with the FARC, and the FARC is having big disputes over territory with the ELN. So I think he's gonna have meetings on the false pretense of we fighting narco terrorism. Let's go after the ELN, but he's still gonna be working with the FARC. And the FARC, they'll tell you that they're working a peace treaty, that they're not involved in narcotics, that they want to be a political, regular force in politics in Colombia. But the truth is completely different. You know, there's too much money involved in there, so they're gonna continue to, they have been doing for over 20 years, 30 years, with involving the narcotics trade. So it's going to be extremely difficult to gradually slow down with the narcotics trade. And also, unfortunately, in the United States, we have so much consumption. So, all this is extremely difficult situations.
Yeah, makes sense. And talking about that, as we are getting close to finishing the episode, with your unique experience in law enforcement, army, seeing all of these bad guys working with drugs and transporting them, and if you were to give an advice or piece of advice to young Americans here, what do you want to tell them? Maybe something related to your own past and how you overcame challenges, or just looking at the present and the younger generations, and something that you want to share with.
Well, when it comes to since we mentioned in drugs, don't experiment. Do not experiment. There was so many instances where, when I was initially doing buy and bust, when I was an undercover on the street, and I hook up with some young people, man, and in their late 20s, 27, 25 years old. I was deep hooked up in heroin, and I'm like, man, you're so young. I hooked up one time with a model, a Brazilian model, and she had a very beautiful face, but you could tell, she had the tracks on her arms, and she was just a mess. And I'm like, but how'd you got into this anyway? Because I was one, I started the conversation with her. Just I try to be friendly with her to eventually get on and to finding who her drug dealer was or whatever. But all it took was experimentation. That one time, that one incident when you say, oh yeah, you know what? I want to try this. Guess what? That addiction, man, is just, it's incredible, especially these hard drugs. And especially now that everything is laced with this fentanyl stuff, one experimentation could mean your life. So stay away from drugs. You don't need that. Find something else. Find hobbies. Stay active. Trust in God. God is everything, and that's basically it, man. Don't when it comes to narcotics, since that's my experience.
Oh, thank you for sharing all this. This is amazing. And if you want, maybe there is a chance to do a second part and dive deeper into some of these topics. But I appreciate you coming on the show today and sharing all this. This is amazing, amazing stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much for the invitation. Take care, my friend.